Hey everybody, John Jericho here. We're going to talk about Kamala Harris and how she compares to some other vice presidents who ran for president later on. I've got a nice little chart here and some infographics I'll show you. And let's get right into it. Let's get serious here, huh? Okay. So we're going to focus on the two major parties here, the Republicans and the Democrats. And for the time being, we will ignore third party candidates, even though I do love them. We'll cover that in a different video. For this one, we're going to focus on the 20th and the 21st century. And we're going to start with Teddy Roosevelt. So he was vice president, President McKinley. He took over in 1901 when McKinley was assassinated, then ran in 1904 as a Republican and won that race. He chose not to run in 1908 because he thought it would be too much time for one man to be president, considering he just served 3 years before that. But he would come to regret that and run in 1912 under the Bull Moose Party, where he lost. Then we've got Calvin Coolidge, who took over after Harding died. He was Harding's vice president. Coolidge won the 1924 election, and similar to Teddy, he decided not to pursue a second election because that would have been 10 years in office, and he believed 10 years is just too long for any one man to be president. Up next, we've got Truman. Now, Truman took over after FDR died. Truman was only vice president for like 81 days, 83 days, something terribly short like that. He had only met FDR like 3 times before becoming president. And so he became president. He did basically a 4-year term there, and then he won his election in 1948, but he did not seek re-election after that, mostly because he was very unpopular. Up next, we've got 1960. Richard Nixon lost his presidential campaign in 1960. He was formerly the vice president of Dwight Eisenhower, and he failed in that 1960 election, but later would redeem himself. We'll get to that. Now, the person that Nixon lost to in that election was, of course, JFK. I got a pretty cool picture of JFK debating Nixon. I'll find that for you guys. Let's not take ourselves too seriously, huh? I'm wearing yellow sunglasses and wearing a suit jacket that I got at the Salvation Army. Where was I? Nixon lost in 1960 to JFK. JFK was assassinated in 1963, of course, terribly. And LBJ took over for him. He finished out that term, ran for election in 1964 and won. But he did not seek re-election in 1968, again, because of deep unpopularity. There's a bit of a trend here. Former vice presidents not running for a second term, either out of unpopularity or out of, in the case of Teddy and Coolidge, out of like a kind of misplaced honor system. So then we have 1968. Hubert Humphrey ran and lost like a loser. The name like Hubert Humphrey, how could you ever win? You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's a rough name to have. I don't know anything about his policies. I don't know anything about him really. I just know that a guy like that's not going to get elected. And the person that Humphrey lost an election to was, of course, Richard Nixon, who redeemed himself in 1968 with a pretty healthy victory. Somehow, it got worse in 1972. Nixon won all but 3 states. His electoral college was 520. I believe Nixon won every state in that election except for Massachusetts and D.C., which is crazy. And then 2 years later, he's packing. He's leaving. He's resigning in disgrace. Now, he is the only president on this list who served 2 consecutive terms after previously being vice president. Of course, this time was cut short, and Gerald Ford took over for Richard Nixon. Now, Gerald Ford ran for election in 1976. Didn't make the cut. People didn't like him. Nobody liked him. And people didn't like Nelson Rockefeller, either his vice president, but that's beside the point. Then in 1984, we have former Vice President Walter Mondale. I don't know. I'll go back and fix this. You've probably never heard of him. And that is because he lost in a landslide to Ronald Reagan. And I believe at this point, Ronald Reagan became the most popular president ever to win an election, displacing Nixon from a few years earlier. That was 1984. Then we jump 4 years ahead to 1988, where Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, runs and wins. Not only was he Reagan's vice president, he was also the director of the CIA for a time, which, to me, it's crazy that the American people voted in a guy who used to run the CIA. But hey, that's neither here nor there. In 1992, George H.W. Bush runs again, loses to Bill Clinton, old Slick Willie. And in 2000, we have Al Gore, who was Bill's vice president, running and losing to George W. Bush. And then in 2020, of course, we've got Joe Biden, who was Obama's vice president. He won, and similar to some of his predecessors, I was going to say he refused to run again, but that's not really true. He did run, and then he dropped out. Whatever. The point is that he's not in the general election in 2024 any longer, and there's a few different reasons that people cite for this, but I think we all know it's because he wasn't very popular, and it didn't look good for him against the Donald. So those are all the guys. Oh, how could I forget? Kamala Harris, obviously, is running in 2024, and she is Joe Biden's former vice president. Whether she will win or lose, we will see. I'll be waiting. I'll be adding her to this list. I've got a little drop-down arrow with two options, winner or loser. Which one's it going to be, Kamala? We'll find out in November. Okay, so you're probably asking yourself, well, what does all that mean? Is Kamala going to win? And I don't know. Doesn't mean anything. But let's take a look at these numbers just for the farts and giggles. All right, so it doesn't look great. Out of all those vice presidents who ran for president, only 3 times did a Democrat win. Those 3 Democrats were Truman, Johnson, and Biden. Now, all 3 of those guys did not run for a second term. 3 Democrats who have ever won the presidential nomination after being a vice president. Now, let's look at how many times Democrats have lost. Also 3. So, all right, it's a 50-50 shot looking at these numbers. What does it all mean? Doesn't mean anything. Let's look at Republicans. They lost 3 times, and they won 5 times. Republicans have the edge in that metric. Thank you for watching Then and Now. This is the place where history and current events come together. If there are any subjects on your mind that you want me to cover, leave them in the comments below, and we'll make some videos about them. And as always, remember not to take anything too seriously. I'm just a goofy guy in yellow sunglasses and a blazer. So I had a lot of fun today. I hope you did too. I'll see you next time.